Greetings, everyone. This is Ahmed Khalaf, a Master of Development Practice student at the University of Minnesota, and this is another attempt to understand the United States' approach towards the current situation in the Middle East. I'm very honored to interview Professor Eric Schwartz today to discuss this further. Professor Schwartz is the chair of the Humphrey School Global Policy Area. In 2009, he was selected by the US President Barack Obama to be the US Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. In this capacity, he worked closely with the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He served as the Department of State Principal Humanitarian Official. From 2005 to 2007, he served as the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's Deputy Special Envoy for Tsunami Recovery. Moreover, from 1993 to 2001, Professor Schwartz served as the National Security Council at the White House, ultimately as Senior Director and Special Assistant to the President for Multilateral and Humanitarian Affairs. So Professor Schwartz has a very rich, diverse career in foreign policy making, humanitarian work, and academia, and I'm sure this will make our conversation very insightful today. Thanks a lot, Professor Schwartz, for accepting this invitation. I know this is very busy days for you, but I'm really happy to have you here, and I'm looking forward for the insights from this interview. Thank you very much, and welcome.
I mean, it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to have you in our foreign policy class.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let me start by maybe an old question which revived nowadays. The recent events in Gaza have raised an old question from different generation of Arabs and maybe a lot of people worldwide. The question is mainly, why does the US, which is characterized by its complex, dynamic foreign policy, has always been providing what appears to be unconditional support for Israel? Here I'm discussing this from a historical perspective, not only since the October 7th, but maybe since the start of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, 1948. It seems like that irrespective of the political party in power in the US, whether Republican or Democrat, or the prevailing foreign policy ideology, be it liberal, new conservative, or realist, the American stance has predominantly been in favor maybe of the state of Israel. This support has manifested in various forms, including diplomatic backing and significant foreign aid. I guess Israel is the #1 state which receives foreign aid from the US. One of the statistics I got from UN data is that only from 1972 to 2021, the United States has vetoed at least 53 United Nations Security Council resolution critical of Israel, to the extent that there was a popular video, I'm not sure if you have seen it before or not, for the current Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2001, when he was talking to some Israeli citizens, advocating for the construction of new settlements in the West Bank, despite the Oslo Accords prohibiting such actions. And he said, and I'm quoting, "The main thing is first of all to strike them several times so painfully that the price they pay is unbearable. A large-scale attack on the Palestinian Authority, causing them to fear that everything is about to collapse." When people told him that this might make the US angry, he said, "I know what America is. America is a thing. You can move and maneuver it very easily. Move it in the right direction. They won't get in their way. And even if they say something, so what?" Before I ask you about the motives of the US foreign policy towards Israel, and I guess a lot of people watching this from Egypt and from the Arab world are keen to hear your insights about this. Do you agree or disagree, first of all, with this pre-assumption? Do you think that the US historically has been providing unconditional support to Israel, or you have another perspective on this?
I think it's fair to say, Ahmed, that the United States historically has provided extremely strong support for Israel. That's not to say that the United States administrations and different administrations haven't had difficult conversations and differences with Israeli policy. Most democratic administrations, as you know, have not been happy about the settlement policies in the occupied territories. And traditionally, or certainly the Trump administration, has been less upset about those policies, or was less upset about those policies. But there's no challenging the position that the United States support for the state of Israel has been extremely strong throughout many different administrations. Before I talk about the reasons why, I think it's important to say that, you know, that the policies of the government, the troubling policies of the government of Israel, you know, have created, I think, a changing, you know, dynamic in the United States that Israelis need to be aware of. For example, a majority, I just saw a poll before our conversation indicating that, you know, a majority of American Jews would be supportive of, a majority of American Jews would be supportive of, I can't remember the exact language, but essentially restricting support to Israel to the extent that that support is used for development in the occupied territories. That's a pretty remarkable result. You know, similarly, a majority of American Jews are strongly supportive of a two-state solution with Israelis and Palestinians living side by side explicitly. And an overwhelming majority of American Jews by this poll are supportive of, I think the number was 80% of either a two-state solution or a democratic one-state in the Middle East. So, and of course, we've seen in recent weeks that the support for the current administration, the Biden administration, considered a progressive administration as compared to its alternative. Support from Arab Americans, which are critical constituencies in places like Michigan and other Midwest states, has plummeted. I mean, just plummeted. So I think that is going to have reverberations in the American political system. How significant? Time will tell. Now, in terms of your question, which I guess I should answer, you know, I think that there are several factors that play a role in American support for Israel. I think it would be, you know, I think the most obvious one and perhaps the most significant one, especially, you know, in and around 1948, was the sense of solidarity for Jewish and suffering during the Holocaust, when, after all, 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis. And I have to tell you, as you know, as an American Jew who was a baby boomer, so I was born in 1957. You know, really just a decade after those horrific events, I, like, you know, so many other American Jews, kind of grew up with the memory of that experience. And I think, you know, I think it would be you know, dishonest not to say that that's been a fundamental proposition. I think that Israeli, more recently, of late, I think Israeli support for more broadly American national, the perception of Israeli support for U.S. national security priorities has also played an important role. And also, frankly, the influence of you know, the influence of lobbying groups in support of not only of Israel but of Israeli policy, essentially, has also played a role in enduring support, because in our system, lots of different groups have access to political leaders, and political leaders, you know, respond to those influences. So I think those are many of the factors that have you know, that have played a role.
Thank you very much. You touched on the, like, cultural factor and the political factor inside the US, and I would come to this to ask more about this, and also you discussed the issue of the public opinion, and maybe we can also discuss this further in our interview. But first, I want to ask you about the geopolitical factor, which is also, I guess, it's important. I think it's insightful to recall a statement by President Biden in 1986 during his tenure in the Senate, when he made a firm conviction that the United States shouldn't apologize for its unwavering support for Israel. And he said, and I quote, "There is no apology to be made. It's the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there no Israel, the US would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region." Do you agree or disagree from the geopolitical perspective that supporting Israel is a strategic investment for the US? I mean, people might not understand this so much, but what does the US gain geopolitically and maybe economically for having Israel in the Middle East and providing this kind of support?
Yeah. Let me say that I do believe that support for Israel has served American, as you put it, either geostrategic or geopolitical interests beyond the affinity between the United States and Israel, the historical connection, the notion of a shared democratic tradition and shared democracy, at least in those areas where Israeli citizens are living. So I think, in addition to that, I do think it has served American national interests, but I don't believe, and I'm a supporter of Israel, but I don't believe unconditional support for Israel serves American interests. I don't believe that unconditional, by the definition of that word, support for most friends and allies serves the interests of any government, and I think that's the rub. And I think what are the demonstrations of my initial point? Support for U.S. initiatives beyond the Middle East, the United States and Israel, can often count on one another. A strong and dynamic economic and trading relationship. Threats to American interests, real threats to American interests in the region that come from governments with which the United States is not friendly. The government of Iran, militant and terrorist organizations that operate in the region, intelligence cooperation, and those kinds of relationships do serve American U.S. national interests. But I am deeply concerned by the many of the policies of the government of Israel, and I think the United States, has needed to be much franker and much tougher in its relationships with this, with this ally. And I think because we have not been, I think the interests of the United States, are put at greater risk. Not to mention, humanitarian interests. Of all my history that you described, my professional history, you didn't mention that I'm not blaming you for this, but you didn't mention that I started my career at Human Rights Watch. And, and I've spent much of my career working on human rights and humanitarian issues. And you can't witness the ongoing occupation of the occupied territories and the growing occupation. Before this meeting, just to remind myself, I looked at a map that Peace Now produced on Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and there's well over 100 of such settlements. There's over 400,000 Israelis living in those areas, and if there's going to be a peaceful, ever going to be a peaceful settlement to this terrible conflict, with a sovereign Palestinian state alongside Israel, that reality, in great measure created by the Netanyahu government, will have to be dramatically different. And every single time a new settlement is created, the government of Israel creates additional obstacles. And if you don't think, that has serious implications for American interests in the region, then you don't really understand regional politics. And so I know I've gone beyond an answer to
no, but that's very relevant. So yeah, please go on.
But I wanted to to just give you a greater sense of my own thinking and beliefs on this issue.
Yeah, thank you. That's very relevant. And maybe this would get us, before I ask you about like how do you evaluate the US stance towards this? Before I ask you this, I want to ask more about AIPAC. I mean, because to what extent do you think lobbying is influential in directing the U.S. foreign policy towards supporting Israel? You mentioned this, but I want like to have more highlights from you about this.
Sure.
I'm asking specifically about AIPAC, like because they are the main or the biggest lobby group supporting Israel and works to strengthen the bipartisan support for the U.S.-Israel relationships. They say that they have like more than 3 million members, and they backed like 365, I guess, senators in the House and the Senate in the past elections who have won their seats. Why do you think their role, like there's a lot of lobby groups in the US, but why do you think AIPAC is that influential, if we agree that they are that influential?
Well, let's take a step back and first identify AIPAC. AIPAC is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and it is an organization in Washington that is very supportive of the state of Israel and wants to promote policies that, from their perspective, from AIPAC's perspective, promote both American interests and the interests of Israel. And I haven't studied AIPAC in great depth. I mean, American lobby, but I can say, without fear of great contradiction, that AIPAC is a very influential lobbying group. But and lobbying groups are influential because the money that they put into the political system in support of candidates, they're also they're powerful and effective because of if their membership has people who are closely connected to American politicians, that can enhance their influence, but also they're influential if they have a broad membership who is prepared to reach out to members of Congress that are representing districts that are well beyond the beltway of Washington, D.C., right? So for all of those factors certainly play a role in AIPAC's influence. But I will also identify, and I'm not speaking for any organization here, it's really important that we say that I say that, because I want to tell you about another organization in Washington called J Street. J Street was established, I don't know, about 20 years ago. I don't know if I'm getting that exactly right. And J Street is an organization that by its mission terms itself as a pro-peace, pro-Israel lobbying organization. And they have lobbied very, very strongly against the policies of settlements in the West Bank. They have lobbied very strongly against the policies of the Netanyahu government. They have been highly critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu's efforts to impact the judicial system in Israel. And they have offered a forum, a voice for those who have a more critical perspective. And they have been so influential that a month or two or three ago, there was a fundraising letter from AIPAC. The whole subject of the fundraising letter was a condemnation of J Street, and you can find it you can probably find it online somewhere. But that's an indication. If this organization that is perceived as all powerful has to spend its time and its energy writing a 3-page letter to its constituents about J Street as a fundraising tool, then you have to appreciate the fact that J Street is playing a role. And I would go back to the points that I made before about the fact that I don't believe on many issues AIPAC represents the majority of the American Jewish community. I just don't believe it. The polls make clear that AIPAC does not, but that none of that is to change the fundamental point that, yeah, AIPAC's a very powerful lobbying group, no question about it. They are, and that's part of the political process here.
Yeah, that's referring to J Street. I guess that's very important, because now, I guess in the past months, we've seen a lot of groups, Jewish groups, actually, like also Jewish Voices for Peace and the Liberal Jews. A lot of groups were very active in supporting the Palestinian issue and condemning Israeli policies. And they were present in the protests in New York, DC, and here also in Minneapolis. So do you think in the future these groups can have more significant role, can have more advocacy role towards the U.S. foreign policy? Do you think this is something we might see coming soon? Because it was very observed in the last months, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes. The question is, how powerful will they be? How powerful can they become? But I think, I think that the dynamics of this issue, have a good potential to be changing over the next many months and years, because not only the progressive Jewish community, but I say the progressive Jewish community, but Ahmed, in this 2021 poll, 7 out of 10 American Jews were supportive of the Democratic Party, and only, and so, when you, in a certain way, when you say progressive Jews, it's almost being redundant. But what that means is, that it's a significant basis of support of a more human rights friendly approach toward the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so I guess I'm saying, yeah, I think the potential does exist. I also think in our broader politics within the Democratic Party, there's a real debate going on right now, because there are a lot of very progressive, when I say progressive, I mean, to put it in simplistic terms, folks who are more on the left side of the political spectrum than in the Democratic Party, who are extremely troubled, not only by the policies of the Netanyahu government, but also by the practices over the last several weeks in Gaza. So yeah, I mean, I think things are changing. How quickly in the United States, I don't know, but I think I actually think those changes are also good if they influence the American political process, because I don't think the recent actions of the Israeli government, when I say recent, I'm talking about over the last several years, are well serving American interests in the region. They're just not. And I think that's a real problem. Most recently, the problem has been a humanitarian and human rights related problem in Gaza. But I think there are going to be longer term implications that are not going to be great for Israel, and not going to be great for the United States.
Yeah, Yeah. Thank you. I think this was a good explanation. And now I want to dig deeper with you in the U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East in the past couple of years. I mean, things seem to be like in a total different direction before October the 7th. I mean, the U.S. foreign policy had a strategy to like pivot away from the Middle East somehow and shift its attention to Southeast Asia to confront the rise of China. And there was a belief that the problem in the Middle East could be resolved with more economic and cultural cooperation, normalization with Arab countries, without really resolving the Palestinian issue or even providing Palestinian people with any hope. I mean, like, while the Palestinian situation was getting worse, people suffering more in Gaza under a siege since 2007, and more Israeli settlements established in the West Bank, violating, as you mentioned, maybe the international law and the UN resolutions, more the stall for Palestinians in the West Bank, long time, even no mention for the two-state solution. Simultaneously, the US administration was moving forward, like in the Abraham Accords, entailing normalization treaties between Israel and Arab government, excluding the Palestinians somehow from the equation. And like this was already done with Morocco, with Sudan, with Bahrain, with Emirates. And the most important deal, I guess, was very close to come was with Saudi Arabia before the US elections. Ironically, I'm not sure also if you've seen this, but it was just 8 days before October 7th. The National Security Advisor, Jack Sullivan, he was talking in the Atlantic Festival, and he said, and I quote, the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. This was just like 8 days before October the 7th. And then in a couple of minutes, everything changed. The whole world remembered again that there is Palestinian people who are left in inhumane conditions. The issue raised again, and then it's the question of every day in the U.S. politics and globally. How do you evaluate the U.S. policy towards the Middle East in the past couple of years before October the 7th? Do you think this approach was unsuccessful, successful? How do you evaluate this?
The nicest thing about having this kind of interview is you can ask a question and I can give you whatever answer I want to, or I can get to your question, in a sort of roundabout way, which is what I'm going to do. 20 years ago, there were some people in Washington who were saying that the road to a Middle East peace is through Baghdad. We all know what happened. And there were some people in Washington who were saying 20 years later, the road to sort of peace and stability and the promotion of American interests in the region is through developing stronger economic and diplomatic relations with certain governments in the region and promoting those relationships with Israel. And don't get me wrong, I support that. Why not? I certainly support that. 20 years ago, there was a Arab Israeli or Israeli Arab, perhaps, a scholar, a friend of mine, and a lovely man named Shibli Telhami, who was writing in a book called The Stakes that the Palestinian issue can't be ignored. And he has continued to be making those claims for 20 years, and he's very prominent now in the discussion. And he's right. The problem with the facile assumption that you can solve a security problem without addressing the issue of Palestinian rights forgets the fact that there are millions of Palestinians who happen to have a view about that issue. And it is the responsibility of governments of the world to give those, to ensure that the Palestinian communities have a say in the critical decisions that are going to impact their future, including their ability to have a state. And if you don't provide people with meaningful opportunities, with a path forward, they're not going to go away. They're not going to disappear, but they're going to become more and more desperate, more and more inclined to recognize false leaders who are not, who perhaps are not committed to more peaceful approaches and more peaceful paths. And I think that's, that has been a very, hard-learned lesson. Now, do I think the Biden administration didn't care about peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis? No, I don't believe that. I do believe they cared about it, but I also believe that for the Biden administration, the issue needed to have a much greater priority than it did. Mm-hmm. And the Biden administration had to be prepared to develop a strategy that involved the possibility of confronting the Israeli government in a way that government hasn't been confronted before by the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And if we turned from this to the recent policies, I mean since October the 7th, and thank you for making this linkages with older thoughts about how the peace of the region would start from Baghdad, and I guess this is very insightful. Now reviewing the US policies after October the 7th. So we had, I guess, phases. At the beginning, there was like kind of, the US was clear in support of Israel. Statements of President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken was very clear in supporting the state of Israel in the first week and in many occasions. However, recent developments in the past couple of days suggest that there might be some divergence between the US and Israelis' perspectives on the situation. Several reports in the Washington Post and in other platforms were indicating that the US administration might be a bit frustrated and not very comfortable with the Israeli tactics and strategies in handling the situation. We have seen, for example, the Israeli Prime Minister speaking about full security control over Gaza after the end of the war. On the contrary, on the following day, we heard the Secretary of State Blinken said that Israel shouldn't reassume control over Gaza and it should be controlled by Palestinians, and he refused the scenarios of evacuations of Palestinians to Sinai or Jordan. There is a bit of vagueness and a lot of analysis aren't confident if Israel have a clear plan. So in such a situation, for the short term and the long term, let me first ask you about the short term, and you had a long career in the National Security Council and in the Department of State. If you were still in the administration by now, how would you advise the president to deal with this situation? I mean, in terms of like the short term, and maybe afterwards, if I can ask you about like the long term.
It's a hard question. But let me start by saying, Ahmed, and this is more than just a passing reference or sort of, or checking a box, if you will. I think the starting point for me as a human rights activist and as a humanitarian is to recognize, that the slaughter of 1,400 Israelis by Hamas was unacceptable. It was horrendous. It probably, I haven't done a close legal analysis, but it probably constituted war crimes and crimes against humanity, given the numbers who were killed. The manner in which they were targeted and explicitly killed, the manner in which people were dismembered, it should shock the conscience of humankind. And whether or not, everything that goes, all of the analysis that goes around it, at the end of the day, needs to be set aside when you look at these crimes. And as a result, I think the Israeli government, whatever the problems with its policies, had a right to respond and to target as a military matter those who are responsible for those killings. And I think it's important that I say that because I believe it. But having said that, and having said that they have the right to target, to go after Hamas, the magnitude of the civilian killings in Gaza, and by the middle of last week, the numbers were over 10,000, and some of the estimates were 3,000 or 4,000 of those were children. The magnitude of those killings, and the Israelis argue that they're acting in conformity with international humanitarian law, the laws of war. It doesn't matter. The magnitude of those killings, as a matter of humanity, are just unacceptable. And so, if you're asking me what would I have advised the Netanyahu administration before all this took place, or what am I advising them now? It's a different question. But if it was before, I would say that your response cannot be the kind of broad response that is going to result in the mass killings of civilians. It just can't. First, because of the horrendous damage done to so many civilians, non-combatants, is just something that it is on a humanitarian, on a moral basis, it can't happen. But more importantly, it's not going to achieve. Not more importantly. I stop myself. But importantly, it's not going to achieve the geopolitical objectives, and certainly not going to achieve the objectives of the United States. And we have the United States as an interest in what our own objectives are. And in fact, it may well be the very response that Hamas anticipated and Hamas wanted to have happen. I don't know that. I don't want to attribute, but it has, as American political scientist Stephen Walt predicted, it has turned world opinion again, largely against the Israelis, where there was an enormous amount of sympathy for the terrible suffering that was visited upon 1,400 Israelis. And it doesn't enhance, it increases the possibility, although the possibility of a broader regional conflict, which won't be in anyone's interest, least of all the United States, which is which is occupied in East Asia, is occupied in Europe with Ukraine, and it won't enhance any prospects for a durable peace. So the question then becomes, and I know the question you're going to ask is, okay, so what happens now? You know, I think that you know, I've called publicly, as you know, you listened to an interview that I did when we were in class. I've called publicly for a ceasefire, which we don't really know what that means, because the ceasefire implies some sort of agreement between the parties. Is that feasible? But I support that, because I think the calling up for a ceasefire is because anything to put an end to this kind of military campaign that has had this kind of effect on civilians has got to stop. And happily, it's really up to people who are serving in government, not to me on the outside with limited information, to know exactly how that comes about. I'm not sure that's my job as an analyst or as an advocate, but it certainly is more complicated now, you know, than it would have been several weeks ago, because now the government of Israel's credibility is tied up with what it's begun. And if it had chosen a far more targeted response at the outset, its credibility would not be on the line quite the way it is now. And so it's a very complicated issue. But I think there needs to be a ceasefire, a dramatic reduction in hostilities, and then we sort of pick up, you know, and sort of try to address the humanitarian situation on the ground, and see what is left, you know, by way of the possibility of negotiation.
Thank you. This is comprehensive. It led to different points, and I may react and ask you like a follow-up on one of the points you've raised about like what happened on October the 7th. And I guess nobody is happy with like the killing of civilians anywhere, and I agree with you on this. But don't you think, and I'm asking you this, don't you think that there is a certain narrative trying to start what happened on October the 7th, and this what and I'm quoting here Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN. He said that Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum, as the Palestinians have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. So don't you think that, like, we agree that nobody is it's unfortunate to have killings between civilians, but don't you think that tackling the history should start from 1948, having ethnic cleansing of like 750,000 people, and then in 1967 350,000 people, and then people sometimes forget that the the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who were part of like violent movement against the Israelis for a long time as part of like combating decolonization or so. In the beginning of the 90s, they condemned themselves, they armed the group, they signed on the Oslo Accords, and they went to the Madrid negotiations. And before any other Arab country, most of the countries in the Abraham Accords, they admitted the state of Israel. And then it was more than 10 years without any progress in the two-state solution. So and then so this I'm just suggesting that Hamas didn't start in a vacuum, and then when they started more of like armed resistance in like the 2000s, there was already so long years for no hope, when we're referring even to the West Bank. I mean, the beginning since 2023, where there is no Hamas, more than 200 people were killed, including 38 children. 16 years of like unlawful siege on Gaza, which Human Rights Watch called to be the open air prison. So don't you or how do you find it, thinking that the history didn't start on October the 7th, but it started much earlier than this, and like starting the narrative from here couldn't be the most appropriate? I don't know, what do you think about this?
Well, I'm going to make 4 points in response to your question. First, you heard me say earlier in this interview that a consequence of denying populations hope, denying populations their rights, the despair that is associated with that, a consequence of that is that that populations will look to false leaders who are advocating, the most horrific forms of violence, and even if the populations at large don't necessarily support the particular acts, those kinds of outcomes become more likely. I said that earlier in this. I don't want to sound defensive. Secondly, the history is highly important. And I don't know that I need to say anything more than that in light of everything that I've said during this conversation. I also think, as a practical matter, Israel shouldn't go away. Israel is not going to go away, and I support very strongly the right of Israel to exist as a democratic and Jewish state in the Middle East. I do. That's my position. And so I think the discussion for me is about how Israel can do that and respect the rights of Palestinians and not violate the international law against apartheid. And I guess the final thing I would say is I do believe, as much as I condemn what Hamas has done, and I condemn it and say it, 5 times, I do believe the policies of the Netanyahu government, have created the environment in which this kind of violence becomes more likely. And that's why I don't believe that government, the Netanyahu government, has served the best interests of Israelis, the best interests of Palestinians, and the best interests of the United States. It's really that simple. And if I were in government, I would be working very hard to continue, on the one hand, to continue strong support for Israel, but on the other hand, making much, much clearer that support is not unconditional, that policies that the government of Israel takes that are amenable to the interests of peace will be opposed by the United States in a way that would make a significant and substantial difference in Israeli government calculations. And the United States has really not done that, and needs to do that.
Thank you. I think you made it very clearly, and I would like to ask you about the long-term plan, because this is the most maybe complex question, and maybe one of the things that occurred after October the 7th, that for the first time in a while we've seen the U.S. president speaking again about the two-state solutions. I guess the last one who spoke about this was President Obama, maybe before 2010. I'm not quite sure. But here, and there was a lot of analysts talking about, and we've read this long article by Nathan Brown and other scholars about the one-state reality. So how do you think about the long-term solution between the two-state solutions, which was implied by Oslo since 1993, but there was no progress since then, and other thoughts about one secular state, one secular democratic state? How do you think, or what's your vision? Both scenarios, I'm not sure how can we even navigate to any of them, and I think that the whole situation is quite challenging. But what's your personal thoughts about how the long-term resolution could be?
I think in that one state solution article that we read, which was really drawn from a larger work, at the end of that article, it basically said that the issue is Palestinian human rights, first of all. That the issue is that's not an issue that we can continue forever to say, well, they're under occupation, and once we solve this problem, the Palestinian rights will be recognized because they'll no longer be on occupation. Well, if the occupation goes on for decades, that's not very helpful. And so, the first point was the issue of Palestinian rights has to be confronted now, not later. And then ultimately, what the disposition of the future would be, excuse me, will really be needs to be determined by the parties themselves. And I would just reiterate that. Look, Ahmed, I looked at if you look at that Peace Now map of the West Bank, it's not a very happy picture.
Yes.
But if the political will to make dramatic changes is there, dramatic changes can be made. 400,000 people can move. We know that, right, from history. We know that hundreds of thousands of people can move when they may not want to move. And in this case, such, movement of, I don't know what the number, but of Israelis who are in occupied territory, if the political will to make those decisions is there, those decisions can be made. But it's not, I don't think it's up to us to dictate, the terms of a political settlement. If Israelis and Palestinians decide they want to live in a unified state, as long as it's a democratic state, and as long as that's their decision, I think the international community should accept it. I think the reality is, as difficult as it is to imagine a two-state solution right now, I think in most ways it's more difficult to imagine a one-state solution. And so that's why I kind of believe that should, despite the analysis that we've read, that's why I continue to believe that should be, as we say, the lodestar, what we're seeking to move forward.
Yeah, it seemed quite challenging, and maybe like Yeah, and in the presence of like extreme right-wing government in Israel, I guess it's harder to just imagine such a dialogue. Like we had the Israeli Prime Minister just 2 weeks, I guess, before October the 7th. He was holding the map of Israel in the General Assembly of the UN and referring to the occupied territories in West Bank and Gaza as Israel. So yeah, I'm maybe concerned that it's tough just to think about a long-term solution right now. But
Of course it is.
yeah.
I mean, look, you've heard most of what I think about all this, and if I and so as an American Jew who cares about human rights and humanitarian issues, I will continue to try to, push and promote the perspectives you've heard today. My principal concern is my main concern is the principle of humanity. The fact that it's something that gets lost in all the fact that there's no greater inherent worth to the life of a 5-year-old Israeli child than there is to the life of a 5-year-old Palestinian child. They are if you believe in God, in God's eyes, they are of equal inherent worth, and they each should be accorded rights and the ability to flourish and the ability to have ultimately a life in which they have citizenship and the right to vote and the right to participate in the critical decisions that impact their lives, and the right not to be fearful of being killed. And that's the principle that drives all of the comments that I've offered today. And I don't think what alternative is there to giving up hope? There's no alternative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and given this, like, I mean, your rich experience in the humanitarian aspect, I know I've taken so much of your time, but I have two last questions here. Given from the humanitarian perspective, and I guess in the past months we have witnessed the collective condemnation of the situation in Gaza by UN agencies, independent humanitarian or human rights agencies. The statements of a lot of them was condemning the actions of Israel explicitly or even implicitly. Like I referred before to what the Secretary General of the UN said, and we had Amnesty. They said that the research points to damning evidence of war crimes. They talked about like a third wave of ethnic cleansing, displacing people from northern Gaza to southern Gaza. We had the resignation of the director of the New York office of the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, which described it clearly as like a textbook genocide. And then other statements by WHO, UNICEF, Save the Children, and other entities. And you had a great experience working in this field and maybe leading it at some point in the US government. To what extent do you think that pressure and advocacy exerted by such organizations could help in de-escalating war and de-escalating the violations by the government of Israel and the war crimes? Because we're at a moment when people, they lose their belief in all like the multilateral entities and their capability of bringing a real change when you see, and I think now it's even more difficult than 20 years ago because you have Instagram, you have horrible videos. It's not like when the content wasn't this rich 20 years ago. So do you think that those organizations, do you think there's a way this advocacy can play in de-escalating violations and de-escalating the war, or this is more political, and the capabilities of this ecosystem is limited?
Well, I don't think I would necessarily use the word de-escalating, because sometimes, advocacy can actually escalate elements of certain issues or conflicts, etc. But what I really interpret your question to mean is, do these institutions have an impact, right? I think that's really what you're asking, and the answer to that question, to my mind, is unquestionably they do. And let me just give you some examples where sort of how. First of all, a lot of these human rights organizations have the attention of legislators, and legislators use them in hearings, in legislation, in their own advocacy with the administration. In fact, the U.S. administration uses them in the preparation of their very own human rights reports. The State Department produces human rights reports, and they draw on the expertise of many of these organizations. These organizations also have loud voices. And so, and they also, to the extent that they're seen, and many of them are seen, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and some of the institutions of the UN are seen as credible sources of information, then they can not only move legislators and executives, but they can also move the public debate. There have been lots of protests and lots of public efforts to engage policymakers from civil society, and those efforts, I think, are informed by the work of these highly credible research and advocacy organizations. The media also takes advantage of their information considerably. I can tell you, when I was at Refugees International, when I was running Refugees International, when I was at Human Rights Watch, I had a lot of interaction with members of the media, and and so all of that creates an environment that can strengthen not only other advocacy efforts, but also can influence how governments behave. There's no question about it.
Yeah, that's great, and maybe this leads me to my final question, because
are we going to break, Ahmed? Are we going to break for dinner, or?
Oh, my pleasure. I'm sorry.
No, I'm fine.
It's my last question.
Okay.
And yeah, I'll hope you after a happy weekend. But this leads me to the point of the public opinion, because recently you mentioned big rallies and big protests in a lot of capitals worldwide, and a lot of cities in the US. And actually, a lot of research studies, like by PEO Research Center, a study 1 week ago, it was saying that younger generations in the US are more pro-Palestine than older generations are. In March, there was also a study by Gallup that most of there is increasing tendency for supporting Palestine between the Democrats. So from a side, there is more public opinion which wasn't happy by the Biden's administration, maybe reaction and like great support to Israel. And as you mentioned, some were talking that we will remember, as the Senator Rashida said, like in 2024, and Michigan and Virginia are one of the states which voted for President Biden in the last elections, and they have a noted proportion of Arab. So this is from a side, and on the other side, Republicans are blaming this administration and are blaming President Biden for not showing enough support to Prime Minister Netanyahu before the events, and blaming them for normalizing, lifting some sanctions over Iran, and like $6 billion were transferred for the first time to Iran in the last months, and they said this was the money they transferred to Hamas, regardless that there was some CIA reports even mentioning that most probably Iran wasn't aware of what happened on 7th of October. We don't know for sure now, but I mean, I'm not sure to what extent do you agree with this, but my thought is that like President Biden is in a tough situation. How would you think this dilemma will affect the elections? Because this is the significant year, and we are, I guess, less than 1 year from the election. So how do you think this will affect this?
I'm glad you raised that, because as you were speaking, it made me think that I was being too cavalier about what the administration ought to be doing. I think what I said, I believe the administration about what the administration should be doing. But beyond the president's sort of historical connection to Israel, there is the politics of this issue, and if you listen to the Republican debate the other night, it didn't include Donald Trump, but had it included Donald Trump, I don't think the substance would have been all that different. But they were all really sort of trying to outcompete one another in terms of, to use your term, sort of the unconditional support that should be given to Israel at this particular moment. And excuse me one second, I hit something.
Sure.
Okay. There are much, if not most, of the Republican Party would take the position that the president needs to be more supportive than he has been, more unconditional, and would probably not have a lot of patience for the president's comments about humanitarian pauses, about the president's support for humanitarian pauses, the president's comments, and the president did give him his due. He made comments about the importance of respect for the laws of war. What difference those comments made, we don't know, but he made those comments publicly. He's pushing for these humanitarian pauses. Those are all things that much of the Republican Party would not have all that much interest in. So his political dilemma is a real one, and that's the challenge of being in a democratic society. You have to take into account opinions that could keep you in office or could keep you from office. And so if I were President Biden's, you asked me what I would do, my response was sort of unconstrained by politics, because I haven't been a politician. I've been a sort of a foreign policy official, but I haven't been a politician. But I also think, these are the demands of leadership. You have to, now it's easy for me to say this, but if you have this idea about what's in the best interest of your country and the best interest of in the region, the best interest of the human rights of Palestinians, ultimately the best interest of Israel, then you got to figure out a way to bring along those who react very negatively to your perspective. That's the special, what they call in the United States, the special sauce of leadership. And but he's got a big task. Assuming he's prepared to push the Israelis much harder on the issue of a peace. The other thing we haven't talked about, and we don't have time to talk about it, but I think, you know, Arab governments have responsibilities here. I mean, I think, you know, I spent most of the time talking about what I think the United States should be doing, but I also think that, you know, governments of Jordan, the Gulf Arab states need to stand up and also be working with the United States in pursuing a Middle East peace. But you know, maybe that'll be our next conversation.
Thank you so much. Before I thank you, do you have any final notes? This was very insightful, and you covered a wide array of topics. Do you have any final notes before I just conclude?
No, I think we've really covered a lot of ground, and your questions were very generous in that they gave me the opportunity to talk about, you know, the issues really in the broadest possible way. So I guess I'll just see you in class next week.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Schwartz. This was very insightful, and I appreciate you calling publicly for a ceasefire. I mean, even a couple of days ago. And yeah, thank you for your time and consideration. I know this is tough and busy days. And finally, like my prayers just are with Gaza. I hope there would be an end for the devastating situation and the tragic loss of lives. I also hold the hope that Palestinian people will soon have their rights, and I guess we agree that this is the only viable path toward resolving this long enduring issue. So yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and see you next week. Have a great weekend.
See you next week.
See you. Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.